CBRS, the number one news show on climate change. I'm Evan Thomas.
And I'm Colin Horton.
And we're here today to talk to you about Venezuela.
Venezuela was first colonized by Spain in 1522. It originally had a plantation culture that was primarily dominated in coffee and cocoa. The independence of Venezuela in 18th to the 19th century led to an economic downturn. Later, the first oil drilling in 1917 and the oil boom in the 1920s ended the coffee era, and this transformed Venezuela from a relatively poor society into Latin America's wealthiest state. Venezuela relies on oil revenues for more than 95% of its foreign income. Because of the decreasing oil price, Venezuela has been struggling as an economy. Currently, the inflation rate in Venezuela is 68.5%, which is the highest in the world.
Wow, 68.5% inflation? That is a big problem. One of the earliest problems Venezuela faced was during the Industrial Revolution, was deforestation.
Okay.
Around the time of the Industrial Revolution, Venezuela was concentrated heavily in agriculture for the coffee and cocoa. This is what resulted in the significant amount of land and deforestation that needed to be deforested. This amount of deforestation continued until the time oil was discovered, which altered their economy, creating significantly more exports for oil than cattle ranching and logging did. In 2000, 38% of Venezuela's carbon emissions were due to deforestation, compared to 45% in energy. The change in the biomass in forests and regeneration of vegetation has actually led to absorption of CO2 rather than emissions, which is a positive. As the 19th century went on, deforestation continued to decrease until 2000, and the deforestation rate was only 0.4%. Now that deforestation continues to decrease because of the Protection Act, a third of their landmass in the systems of parks and reserves is now in play.
From the start of the UNFCCC, Venezuela has been all in on doing something about climate change. In 1992, they signed the UNFCCC and then ratified it in 1994. Venezuela criticized many countries for the lack of ambition in regards to climate change. In 2004, they agreed to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. In 2010, they chose to ratify the Cancun Agreement. All these agreements have done something to go for climate change. In 2013, Claudia Salerno, which is Venezuela's UN negotiator, was offended by a lot of the developed countries that were not considering reducing emissions or paying for the effects that their emissions were having on other countries. In 2014, they decided to host a pre-COP, which really showed how much they're willing to do to have an effect on global warming. Venezuela, in all, has invested $500 million in wind farms and distributed 155 million energy-saving light bulbs. Venezuela is vocal against any increase in carbon emissions. They want all countries, and especially the developed countries who produce the most carbon emissions, to cut emissions. Even though they are one of the leading producers in oil in the world, they have formed a plan to decrease their usage in carbon emissions. They have formed a tree mission that is aimed at reforestation and have started to promote efficient light bulbs as a part of a plan to promote energy-efficient initiatives. They have also begun to use oil more rationally in the last decade and use the revenue from the oil sales from social programs and more environmental initiatives.
Venezuela has been involved in the fight against climate change in several different ways. One way is carbon capture and storage, which they are completely against, and they've been very vocal about this. Hasn't been enough research, and they don't know if it will harm any of their citizens. Venezuela informed the UNFCCC that they did not support the proposal. They did not think it was worth the investment of all that money if results were not guaranteed.
They actually even hosted their own social pre-COP. It brought together government ministries from 47 countries to prepare for the UN Conference of Parties, taking part in Lima, Peru. This gathering is also one event that takes place before the 2015 Paris Conference, where all countries will be asked to make binding agreements regarding the climate change. This really shows their commitment to working with the rest of the world on affecting climate change.
Venezuela has also been very vocal about speaking out against the leading carbon emitters in the world. Venezuelan Prime Minister spoke out against those leaders, saying it was the Industrial Revolution that caused this big problem everyone has, so why shouldn't they have to pay for it? This goes hand in hand with the Common but Differentiated Responsibilities and Respective Capacities framework. This framework, within the UN negotiations, purpose was to recognize respective countries' historical responsibility, like the US, for instance, based on the past contributions to greenhouse emissions that their revolutions were responsible for. Although he believes all countries, including his own country, Venezuela, should cut their emissions, he imagines that Annex 1 countries should make the most action.
During COP21, Venezuela actually joined the High Ambition Coalition. This alliance is made up of rich and developing countries. They want to push for an ambitious, durable, and legally binding deal with a strong review of each country's climate policy every 5 years.
A great thing the Venezuelan government is doing is hosting many government programs that are going to help reforest, provide alternative energies, and they have the great light bulb thing we were talking about earlier.
Right.
One specific thing is the tree mission initiated by the government in 2006. It protects a total amount of 58 million hectares of forest and carried out a mass program of reforestation. This led to Venezuela's history of decreasing forestation, resulting in an absorption of CO2 instead of emissions of CO2. Another thing is the light bulbs. They've replaced 155 million inefficient light bulbs with newly developed eco-friendly ones. Also, 70% of Venezuela's energy is hydroelectric. The government also plans to invest $500 million per year into these types of alternative energies.
Today we have a special guest, Elena Shu. She's a representative from Venezuela.
Thanks for having me today.
Elena, there's a lot of negative consequences of climate change. What are some specific vulnerabilities Venezuela faces?
Okay, so I'm going to share with you today 5 vulnerabilities for Venezuela. The first one is less phytoplankton. So basically, there's a temperature changing, and then it will reduce the phytoplankton food resource in Caribbean, and then it will affect Venezuela fishermen, and also it will result in the rise in price, so some citizens can't afford the fish products.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a negative. That would definitely affect economically so many people in the civilization that won't be able to afford as much food anymore. And marine life is definitely an important thing for fishermen. So that's, yeah.
I agree, Evan. That's a very good point you made. You said you brought a few other vulnerabilities. We'd love to hear about them.
Sure. For the second one, it is about the drought. So since 1998, the drought increased like 60%. So it really affects Venezuela citizens near those particular areas. And so the next vulnerability is the glacier in Venezuela. Glaciers are melting at an accelerated rate in the Venezuela. So it causes violent flooding and make it dangerous to travel across. The flow of salt water into fresh water can threaten sources of drinking water. For the economic impacts, it will cause a lot of damage to homes and buildings surrounding the water, costing a lot of money to rebuild. For the social, people may want to migrate to other places due to flooding. The next vulnerability is the rising temperature and Venezuela frogs. So the rising temperature is putting frogs and toads in critical danger. So they are basically responsible for eating many of the mosquitoes. And then their populations is increasing. That will increase the diseases such as malaria. So for socially, that this could have a large impact on the diseases for the decreasing population. And economically, the government will spend money on treatments instead of spending money on other things that will help the company. The next vulnerability is a less oil dependent world. Um, so the burning of fossil fuel is a major contributor to the recent rise in carbon in our atmosphere. With the rate carbon is filling in, it is the most logical solution to just stop burning these fossil fuels and look for alternative energy sources. So if solar, hydro, and wind power become the majority, the Venezuelan economy will be shocked and go into a recession, which leaves Venezuela highly vulnerable. With an economy's crash, citizens will want to see some people take action and turn the country's economy around. And then the absence of oil being used as an energy source would mean the loss of many jobs for Venezuelans.
Yeah, I can see how a less oil dependent world would be bad for Venezuela, but it'd be interesting to see if there's any positive opportunities coming from a less oil dependent world.
Sure. Let me introduce you the first opportunity, which is the bigger oil market. For the ecological change, the increased carbon in the air all around the globe. This is leading to countries such as US not waiting to deplete their oil resources because it is resulting in even more carbon in the air. Venezuela government, people working in the oil industry will be benefiting because US will come to them for oil instead of using their own. Venezuela will look to them for oil, seeing that they're a top oil producer in the world, and economically will drive up to the Venezuelan economy and create more jobs. The next opportunity is new renewable energy. Venezuela has not acted on their increasing carbon footprint, so it will lead to opportunities for sustainable energy like wind and solar energy for people like engineers, construction workers, and scientists. Ecologically, this would make the environment better and make the economical situation of Venezuela less dependent on oil. It will also make Venezuela in a better situation politically when meeting with other countries to discuss global warming. Another opportunity is government programs. So, global warming causes drought and it has negative impacts on social and environment. And then Venezuela government create Ministry of Eco-Socialism and Water. It will implement the National Water Plan and make sure the public access to water. They will also work on missions for the deforestation. The creation of the new ministry is to directly respond to demands when facing climate change. So politically, citizens will be unhappy with the drought. This is a way to build trust within government and citizens. And it will also provide job opportunities economically. The next opportunity is the rising sea level. The increase in water levels will make hydroelectricity more efficient and readily available as it accounts for 70% of the power in Venezuela. Since the supply of water will go up, so the demand will also go up for the hydroelectricity. And then also it is the cheapest way to generate electricity, and it will also benefit the economy as they start using more hydroelectricity and save money. Let's move on to decreasing deforestation. As the carbon level increases, people will start to deforest less to help with these rising carbon levels, which will suck up unwanted carbon. 70% of plants and animals live in forests, and deforestation is destroying their habitat, which will lead to loss of species and major vegetation growth problems and increase the country's landslide and flood numbers. Socially, this is an issue because of the deaths associated with natural disasters. So, eliminating or decreasing deforestation will help save species, their habitats, and our environment.
Some really interesting stuff you gave us there, Elena. Thanks a lot for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me today.
Hi, we welcome Sunday in the show, who studies the effects of climate change, but more specifically, the social impact it brings.
Hi, Sunday. Welcome to the show. How you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on the show.
Anytime. So, as we all understand, fossil fuel burning is the leading cause of climate change. What's Venezuela's history of fossil fuel burning?
Okay, so actually Venezuela doesn't have a history of burning a large amount of fossil fuels. Currently in Venezuela, the carbon levels are not as high, vary between 1.58 and 1.85 is not a large numbers. And also Venezuela is the 28th rank in the world in carbon emission. Also, compared to the number one ranked country, China, Venezuela really didn't produce a large numbers of carbon dioxide emissions.
Poor people and indigenous people make up a large percent of Venezuela's population. Could you tell me more about their role in their carbon usage?
Yeah, actually 50% of households in Venezuela live in poverty. Their carbon footprint isn't high because they don't have a lot of money to spend on food or use of transportation. They are vulnerable to climate change in many ways, like the flooding or any nature disasters. On the indigenous people part, carbon emissions are low as they play a role in preventing the destruction of forests and the release of carbon stocks. As a result of deforestation, indigenous groups would be forced to migrate from their original lands. They can also be negatively affected by the fishery collapse, as that is one way they obtain food.
Okay, so I see that poor people and indigenous people make up a large percentage of Venezuela's population, and they're obviously very vulnerable in Venezuela. Are there any other vulnerable populations in the country?
Yeah, actually, there are also another parts of the population in Venezuela are vulnerable when they are facing the climate change. First, like the fishermen, the modest changes in temperature alter the trade wind, reduce marine organisms in the Caribbean Sea, which led to the fishery collapse in Venezuela and led more than 30% of the fishermen lost their jobs. Another vulnerable population will be women, as 7% of women in Venezuela can't even get primary school education. Their income levels are much lower than men. When they facing the nature disasters such as flood, mudslides, or any common nature disaster in Venezuela, since women have less access to education and information, it's hard for them to manage the climate-related disaster to agriculture or livestock.
Okay, Sunday, so we see what kind of problems climate change can bring Venezuela. What are some ways that Venezuela can combat these problems, and what kind of trade-offs will this bring?
Yeah, actually, I have 5 trade-offs today to share with you guys. First will be if the Venezuela government can decrease the deforestation, like less cattle ranching, mining, and logging is the trade-off. As a result, workers in those industries would be at a high risk of losing their jobs. And second, the government can reduce oil exploitation. However, this may result in less jobs and a possible collapse of the economy. Third, Venezuela could reduce the amount of forest fires, but this would need to make the trade-off of spending more money to hire people to regulate and monitor forest fires. Next, Venezuela can have to deal with the trade-off of less electricity for air conditioner, lights, and technology. And last, government can have to make a trade-off and spend more of their money on finding an additional source of energy and making it efficient will also be difficult to find another source of energy.
Hi, welcome back once again to CBRS News, and thanks for sticking with us.
Today, we have Lauren here. She's a representative from the FCC, which Venezuela brought in to help with their problem with climate change. How are you today, Lauren?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm well. What are some recommendations you would suggest to the country of Venezuela to reduce their carbon emissions? And what impacts would this create for Venezuela?
The FCC believes Venezuela should invest in alternate forms of energy such as hydroelectricity and wind energy. Since they have already invested $6 billion in a hydroelectric plant in the Caroni Basin, they should invest an additional $4 billion in another one while they still have the workers and materials readily available. Some impacts this would create for Venezuela would be building an additional hydroelectric plant will create more jobs in Venezuela while the oil industry is down and at the same time allows them to use a cleaner form of energy. Suggests that Venezuela invests $250 million in wind energy. Wind energy would allow Venezuela to build 4,000 wind turbines. On average, wind turbines save 18,000 pounds of coal from being mined and 36,000 pounds of CO2 from entering the air every year. There are also many pros and cons for Venezuela to invest in new forms of energy. One pro is that it could greatly lower the carbon emissions in the air. By just investing $250 million in wind turbines, it could prevent 144 million pounds of CO2 emissions in the air. It would give Venezuela's climate negotiators more power in the meetings because they wouldn't be known as a country that is so invested in the oil industry, but as a country that is committed to affecting climate change. Since Venezuela is already in an electricity crisis, this would give them a substantial amount of energy to use. On the other hand, this investment could set back the people of Venezuela for generations because of the debt that they would be in. When dealing with hydroelectric power, it is at risk to being useless if Venezuela is in a drought. In the past few years, that has been the case. Another recommendation for Venezuela is to put a 10% tax on oil exports for all countries. This will keep countries from buying excessive amounts of oil, which will result in less carbon emissions. A portion of the tax income will go to Venezuela itself to invest in alternate forms of energy. Another small portion of the tax income will go towards poor countries to help them with research in renewable energy and disaster relief. The oil export tax will result in a loss of revenue by about 10% for the country's government, as less countries will be buying their oil. Other countries' politicians may be upset about the new tariff. Additionally, the politicians in office while the tariff is put in place, may not be re-elected as a result of a decrease in the economy. The benefit of this tax is that there will be less carbon emissions hurting the environment since not as much oil is being bought. We recommend that Venezuela should plant 100 million trees in order to lower the carbon emissions by 8%. Since deforestation accounts for about 38% of Venezuela's carbon footprint, reforestation will help lower their carbon emissions by planting more trees to absorb the carbon in the atmosphere. The approximate cost of reforesting an acre of land is about $70 to $200. Venezuela should invest $1 million towards reforesting large areas that have been deforested. The benefits provided by the addition of trees, such as reduction of air pollution, energy saving, cleaner water, more jobs for planters, would exceed the cost to plant and maintain them by an average of nearly 3 to 1. Researchers found that the net economic growth of the environmental services provided by the world's forest biome is $4.7 trillion annually. On the other hand, planting and maintaining trees requires money investment and human resources as it costs about $70 per acre. Reforesting areas will decrease carbon emissions in Venezuela's lower atmosphere, the crops surrounding the trees will benefit, and dangerous erosion will be minimized. Although a trade-off of reforestation would be less area for cattle ranching, which is the primary reason for deforestation.
All right, very interesting recommendations. I feel like they could be very beneficial to combating climate change for Venezuela and even the whole world.
I really agree, Evan. So how would these recommendations affect the vulnerable populations of Venezuela?
Fishermen, women, poor people, and indigenous people will be positively and negatively affected by these recommendations. For fishermen, the modest change of temperature reduces phytoplankton food sources in the Caribbean, resulting in 30% of fishermen to lose their jobs. Since building a hydroelectric plant can create lots of job opportunities, people living besides the coast can get a better job instead of living on fishery. For women, since oil contains many chemicals that can have harmful effects on pregnant women if they come in contact with the oil, using a different form of energy will reduce the risk of oil rig disasters and have a positive impact on women. Additionally, the government-operated social missions, which is a set of programs that use oil revenues to support women by economic needs, contributing to a 27.6% drop in poverty rates. Putting a 10% tax on oil export will lessen the revenue, cutting the social welfare of women, including education and healthcare. For poor people, building hydroelectric plant provides opportunities for poor people to get better jobs. Venezuela is a net importer of food. It is estimated that 50% of households still live in poverty. The export tax will decrease oil consuming from other countries, and the poverty rate will be even higher. This leads to issues for poor people, including food shortage and security. For indigenous people, since they had to migrate from their original land due to deforestation, and it also disrupted their daily lifestyle, now that reforestation will occur, it will have a positive impact on indigenous people living in the southern part of Venezuela, because if trees were regrown, they would be able to move back to their original land. Reforestation also provides indigenous people with more crops and cleaner water.
Interesting points you have, Lauren. Venezuela seems that it is in great hands having you on this project.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime. All right, well, that about wraps it up for us tonight. Thanks a lot for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next week.
Have a good one.